My name is Paul Tilstone from Festive Road, and today I'm in conversation with Jerry Underwood from the Columbia Sportswear Company. Jerry, welcome.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me.
It is an absolute pleasure. Well, I guess what I should probably start by saying is the reason that we're having this interview is you amazingly took the time to contact us and say that the Purposeful Travel model had given you a framework to kind of organize your thoughts. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. As I think we talked about previously, we were really sort of stuck and at a crossroads, really between your permissible travel model that we used early in the pandemic and purposeful travel. We really were working hard to establish a framework, but we just couldn't quite figure it out.
Okay, well, that's good to know that we were able to help you, and obviously all of the buyers who fed into that process as well. So thank you to everybody that did that. And if you're watching. Now, let me ask you, the first question is, how was either your own personal approach or the company's approach to travel and the situation we find ourselves in the moment? How has that kind of changed at the moment? Give us a description of the landscape that you're operating in at the moment.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll back up a little bit and talk about sort of how we started down this path, right? I think that back early in the pandemic, February, March of 2020, like many of the other folks who may be listening to this, we really just started working on many of the tactical aspects associated, frankly, with completely putting our program to sleep. There was a period of time early in the pandemic where we went to virtually zero travel. We started working on, again, all of that sort of logistical stuff in terms of what are we going to do with our non-refundable tickets, making sure that we've got all of our travelers globally back where they need to be. We're actively managing travel in about a dozen countries around the world. We had people like everybody all over the place. We needed to ensure their safety, that they were where they were going to ride out the pandemic. But once we'd accomplished that, within a couple of months, we really started thinking about, now that we've put this to sleep, what's it going to look like as we begin to wake it back up? And for the most part, we began thinking about resource development. As people come back out onto the road for business travel, what are the resources that they're going to need to do that safely and comfortably? But with that being said, we really were sort of struggling with an overall framework, sort of a strategic framework to how do we go about doing that? And that really is where the purposeful travel model came into play.
Great. And can you sort of give us some sense of how far is your thinking progressed around that sort of defining the why of travel? I mean, we got the 4 steps, but I don't want to confine you to those 4 steps. Give us a sense of where you are.
No, I think we're squarely in the middle. We're squarely at the intersection between permissible travel and purposeful travel. And when I think about what is this ultimately going to look like going forward, I think that there will be aspects of both of their models for us coming out of the pandemic. You know, one of the greatest values that we've gotten from the purposeful travel model is it really has allowed us to take the time to ask ourselves some tough questions about what was our program pre-pandemic and what would that program look like post-pandemic. And it's really been an interesting process to engage with some of my internal stakeholders, legal, risk, HR, and ask ourselves those tough questions. This is what this program looked like before. Will it look the same, or should it look the same coming out of the pandemic? And so the purposeful travel model really helped us start that process of creating a framework by having those conversations that I don't think without it, we necessarily would have had.
And have you started having those sort of deeper discussions about what the return of travel is, what the value of travel is to the business, and trying to define that?
We absolutely have. You know, we started, for example, with purpose of travel, right? Why do we travel, and why should we be traveling? Or why should we be traveling? You know, we want to make sure that there is some sort of return on our investment, right? We have historically thought about travel as a cost, and you identified that in the purposeful travel model. but shifting from thinking about travel as an expense to thinking about it as an investment has really been a fundamental conversation that has helped us move this program forward and will help us manage travel more effectively as we come out of the pandemic. We also really like the concept of default to virtual, right? We have had a jump on an airplane mentality for years, and that has served us well. But I think that coming out of the pandemic, really saying, all right, if an engagement needs to occur, we should consider defaulting to virtual, and only then when we have determined that that is not viable, then start thinking about what does our framework look like coming out.
And are you measuring that return? You're trying to quantify it in monetary value, or do you see there are other types of value in the trip?
Great question. It's really twofold, right? I think that historically, when we've thought about travel as a cost, we really thought about the return as a financial investment primarily. But what we've learned through our internal conversations and moving through the model is that there are a lot of other types of travel that occur that maybe the return is more human-based, more learning-based, and we need to take that into account as well. We're still working through that process of determining exactly how do we measure that, but we certainly are taking it into account.
It's funny, I was just about to extend to how do you measure that you've actually got a return on travel when you're talking about human-based components. And I guess it's going to be happiness of people in the work environment, maybe attrition of staff, days off sick, all those sorts of components, which I guess are kind of traditional HR components as well, right?
I think it's all of those things, but I think that most fundamentally, it is a conversation between traveler and their approver. And, we are a company, we give our people a lot of latitude in terms of decision making. We feel like, we empower them to make the right choices. And I think that, as I said, most fundamentally, this is going to be a conversation between traveler and their approver. And if there is a determination that there is value to the enterprise as a result of this trip, then we will move it forward.
I think whilst we're just talking about kind of a focus on the personal components and personal development components, one thing we should have touched on at the beginning, which I actually found fascinating when we started talking, is your reporting line has changed, doesn't it? So maybe you could just give us a quick insight into how that's changed and why.
Absolutely. So for the vast majority of time that I've been at Columbia Sportswear Company, my reporting line has been up through procurement. I think that's very typical today in a lot of organizations. But as we've gotten deeper into the pandemic and realized that on the other side of it, resource development needs to be a priority, employee wellness has to be a priority. Everything that we do now related to travel gets looked at through a lens of employee health and safety. So my reporting line has changed. I now report up through the HR organization directly to our chief HR officer. And that has really been a great adjustment in terms of refocusing the travel function, not just, being really transactional and really dollars and cents driven, but being employee driven as well.
So it's given you a new set of eyes to view the program through at a time when actually everything that you're focusing on has to have the travel of the person in the middle of that whole process. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
We back in November conducted a traveler sentiment survey where we surveyed about our 250 top travelers globally. And it was so fascinating to look at the results of that. Even our most seasoned road warriors feel that travel is an important function of their job. They feel like they want to get back out on the road, but there has been a really high level of anxiety about going back out on the road. We just, within the past several weeks, redid that survey. We resurveyed that same group of employees, basically the same questions. We're still analyzing the results, but sort of a cursory glance indicates that we are seeing a significant shift in a positive direction regarding employees' willingness and comfort getting back out on the road.
Which is really great news. One of the things when we were talking before you referred to was the power of the section on old thinking versus new thinking in the purposeful travel model. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about why that bit was so important to you.
I think that it was so important to us because we were really thinking about the program as it had been. And the model, it just gave us a certain level of freedom, in fact, to ask ourselves some really tough questions about why are employees traveling? Why is travel important to the enterprise? And is what was important pre-pandemic the same as what will be important post-pandemic? You know, when we think, for example, one of the important things that really came out of our conversations as well, and I think that this too was identified in the model, revolved around competition, right? Because, you know, we're all in business, we're all out here to make a buck, and we've got competitors in the marketplace. And really one of the most robust conversations that we had surrounded us traveling versus our competition traveling, right? It's one of those things that, frankly, I personally had not even thought about as we moved into this process, and thinking, you know, if my competitor is sitting in front of my customer and we're not, does that somehow create a disadvantage for us? So that's just an example of really the many interesting and challenging conversations that we worked through, myself and my stakeholders, as we were sort of figuring out what is our framework going to look like on the other side of COVID.
I love the way you put that section gave you the freedom to ask yourself some really challenging questions. So you've identified sort of personal and business ROI. You've identified the competitive advantage that travel will bring you, and to think about it in that. What other foundations are there to the way that your travel program will be rebuilt?
A couple of things that we're really looking at primarily is, first of all, impact on the planet is a big part of this conversation as well. You know, we were focused on sustainability coming into COVID. We are refocused on it as an enterprise, but as a travel program as well, coming out the other side. And then really this, I would say primarily, you know, I would say the most important component of this for us is this rethinking of travel as an investment versus travel and as an expense. And it really goes back to that ROI conversation we were having previously. That really is going to be a significant shift in our way of thinking.
So you've gone through some of the thinking about the types of travel. Has that gone any further? You've talked about personal and business ROI. Are there any other types of travel that you've defined, or reasons for travel?
Yeah, there really are 5 key reasons or 5 key elements that will need to be in play as we look at approving travel as we come out of the pandemic. First and foremost is an expected ROI. As we've talked about earlier, that may be a dollars and cents ROI, or it may be more of a human ROI that overall benefits the enterprise. Operational integrity, number 2, will be essential as we look at approving trips. Is the trip somehow going to result in a store staying open or one of our distribution centers staying active? Employee safety, always at top of mind. So if the trip results in employee safety, it will be approved. Competitive advantage, big deal, right? If our competitors are sitting in front of our customers, but we're not, that potentially puts us at a competitive disadvantage. And then finally, if we are committed contractually to make a journey, we definitely will do it. So those really are the business outcomes we'll be looking for as we approve trips coming out of COVID. Okay,
great. And I guess sort of last big question is, as you defined yourself, I think, as a medium-sized enterprise. Would that be fair?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I like to say we sit squarely in the middle market.
Which great, which is really interesting because, I mean, to date, I think all, if not the vast majority of companies we've had in these interviews have been the sort of biggest types of companies. So do you have any insights or lessons, especially for that mid-market, on what this means for either your role, for your program, or for your suppliers?
The number one learning for myself moving through the purposeful travel model is that there is not a one size fits all solution here, right? We have to take into account our culture. We have to take into account the level of tolerance that the organization can take on from a policy and procedure standpoint. But really, moving through this has taught me that you have to make those decisions, not necessarily based on what some other company is doing, but based on what works best for your own. And asking yourself some of those hard questions up front will really help you to get there.
Do you think there's a faster shortcut way to kind of get this done, or do you have to go through those really hard questions and challenging yourself to get to the other side? I'm interested whether you, having gone through it, whether you think that's the case.
Paul, I'm one of those people always looking for a shortcut. What I've learned here is there is no shortcut. You will reap the benefits of pulling your stakeholders together, understanding, really asking yourself those tough questions. This is what the program was. Is it what the program will be? Maybe the answer is yes, right? For some organizations, that might be the case. We learned very quickly that that wasn't going to be the case, that we did want to see some change in how we as an organization approached managed travel. The purposeful travel model really helped us do that.
Fantastic. Now, last time we spoke in preparation for this call, you mentioned that there was a global all hands meeting, C-suite were presenting, and you've been invited to join them on stage. That was last week. Is that right?
It was last week. I have to say it went great, but I think it was absolutely indicative of the different level at which travel, even in a program of my size, is getting attention across the organization. The fact that, the function was asked to come to the meeting to present about travel, that might not have happened 18 months ago, but it simply reiterates the importance now of this function and how important it is that we have a good, solid, employee-focused framework coming out of the pandemic.
Well, Jerry, I want to thank you for joining us today, sharing insights into what it's like to move to HR and having the employee and traveler at the center of the experience, and looking at the return on investment from a personal development point of view, as well as a financial view. And also taking advantage of the time to shine that you're in at this present moment to make a big difference to the organization and take a much more strategic view on travel. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Paul, thank you so much for having me, and really to the entire team at Festive Road for putting together both the Permissible Travel and the Purposeful Travel models. For me personally, they've been really key in helping us successfully move through this.
Thank you. And you're a regular podcast person, aren't you? Actually making them, not being on the receiving listening end. So you've been a model interviewee. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so thanks for joining us again for another episode of the Era of Purposeful Travel. You can download the model at festive-road.com free of charge. Please subscribe below if you'd like to make sure you listen to any future episodes. And thanks for joining again. Have yourself a very purposeful year. Bye.